So, good evening, everybody. Welcome. It's an honor for us to have Carol, first of all, here. Thank you very much, Carol, for joining us. You know, I was telling my dear friend Endy, I know Eddie now since 2012 or 13, something like
12,
that.
yeah.
12. Eddie, at that time, has started with HALC. And I had an opportunity to join a meeting of HALC the other day somewhere else. So I told them that in memory of Nikos Mouyaris, a very dear and close friend of mine for several years, I told them that from now on, HALC has found its home here in the Consulate General of Greece in New York. So Eddie, here, you're at home.
Thank you.
So I don't want to take more of your valuable time. I welcome Professor Phillips here,
Thank you.
also an old friend from other years, and every success to your endeavors.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you now, the Consulate General opening not only for giving us a home here, but especially today because he's hosting the Minister of Defense. So for him to spend time with us when he has a minister in town and open up the consulate to us shows what a good friend he is to HALC and to Nikos' memory. Before I start with my good friend, colleague, David, I do want to make some announcements. Now, today we roll out, last year we piloted a program called the Leadership 2030 program. When we started, when Anthony and Dasos and Andres and all of us started this, we made a promise to Nikos that as we got bigger as an organization, we were also going to get younger. We were not going to grow old in these positions. So we started a program called Leadership 2030, where we always, we take a class, a generation of people who are 30 or younger and have finished one degree. And we put them through a training program, a mentorship program, and 2030 refers to the year that we think we're going to have produced about 300 of you through this program. We're trying to keep it 50-50 men and women, which just that's going to be revolutionary. And just for the guys who we're about to introduce, so you know, the women were better in the interviews. Obviously, this is something that Nikos was very excited about. I also want to acknowledge Carol. Nikos was the father of HALC. That makes Carol our mother. So we're bringing you new kids in the family, Carol, new grandkids. The big announcement is that we have in front of you, and I'm going to ask them all to stand, the latest class of Leadership 2030 Fellows. So, and some of them are already standing, but they can raise their hands in the back. But they also have a new moniker. They are no longer the Leadership 2030 Fellows. They are the Nikos Mouyaris Leadership 2030 Fellows. And the program is going to be called the Nikos Mouyaris Leadership 2030 Program, supported by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. Andreas Drakopoulos and Stavros Niarchos Foundation so believed in Nikos' vision of a new generation of leaders. They are endowing this program. They're providing a $1 million endowment grant, which is when you guys will take over at 2030 and you will be launching the Leadership 2040 program then. So we're excited. This is their first time as a class today, David, so that's an honor to you, I think, right?
It is.
And I'm excited. We do a lot of stuff policy-wise. Today, you guys can sit down. Today was you know, another big day and kind of the mission and stuff that the legacy of Nikos, some of you remember, you know, Lena Petros reported on it almost a year ago. We launched the No Jets for Turkey campaign, you may remember. The ad in the New York Times that drove Sophia and me crazy. But, you know, and everybody thought we weren't going to do anything, right? People were making fun of it. A lot of you showed up on Capitol Hill. You worked for it. Last year we passed 2 pauses on F-35s. David was part of one of the conferences. And today, a new piece of legislation, Senator Van Hollen, Senator Shaheen, Langford, and Tillis introduced new legislation. And Congressman Sarbanes, Andres Sequeira, used to work for him, did an appropriations letter. This was a milestone moment for the No Jets for Turkey campaign. So as much as it's great on policy, you guys, as I'm talking to the Leadership 2030 people, Tassos can tell you, Anthony can tell you, Andreas, nothing excited Nikos more than cultivating new leaders. So you're the ones who are going to keep his legacy alive forever. And it starts with being a very well-informed diaspora, right? Mm-hmm. So that leads us to our program today. I'm excited to welcome back a good friend, David Phillips from Colombia. I won't get into your full resume because I'm going to make you guys all get the book, and it's in here. But I want to jump into your latest book, The Great Betrayal, but just as a setup question, how do you get your timing? You just nailed this, right? Your last book, Uncertain Ally, right, that about Turkey, you got it right when Turkey fell off the cliff. And I think The Great Betrayal literally came out right after President Trump had that call with Erdogan, right?
On December 19th.
On December 19th.
So,
And can you give me lotto numbers?
So I foresaw that the Kurds would be betrayed because of the events in Iraq. I felt the Kurds in Syria would suffer a similar fate. When Kirkuk was occupied by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and by the Iraqi army, the governor of Kirkuk, who was my very dear friend, who took me to Iraq on my first visit in 1992, fled as assassins closed in on him. So I was deeply concerned for his well-being. It was actually with the help of Senator Van Hollen that he was able to find some safety and some freedom. He's a Maryland resident, so all politics is local. And I felt that as a tribute to Governor Najmuddin Karim, that I wanted to write a book about the misfortune of Kurds in Iraq, and to send a warning that the Kurds in Syria would suffer a similar fate. I was in Syria, in Qamishlo, on December 17th, just 48 hours before Trump made his announcement about the immediate and complete withdrawal. So when you study the trends in political history, you can foresee problems before they happen. Mm-hmm. Kurdish issues have been very dear to me since I met Governor Karim. Mm-hmm. So as a tribute to him, I wanted to write this book. I didn't realize it would be so timely or relevant. But as I explained to an audience, when you're writing about the betrayal of the Kurds, it's always timely. Because tragically, the Kurds have been betrayed over and over again during the 20th century and up to this day.
Yeah, let's pick up on that. You know, there was a great Christopher Hitchens book, Hostage to History. It's about Cyprus. So, you know, we all got that. It's time after time after time, Cyprus was betrayed, or Cyprus missed an opportunity. And your book does a good job laying out how the Kurds have gone through that. Multiple, I'm not going to give it away, or you can if you want, the multiple stages of betrayal. From Woodrow Wilson now to George H.W. Bush to Donald Trump and Barack Obama. But can you go through those stages of betrayal?
So the Kurds, rather sadly, have been their own worst enemy. Part of the reason why they had been betrayed by great powers is because they've never succeeded in coming together and having a unified front to advance their national aspirations. This was first apparent in Versailles. There were several Kurdish delegations who were there. When the great powers met with...
This is after World War I.
This is right after World War I. This was the Paris Peace Conference. So all of the aspiring nations sent delegations to Versailles. And as the Ottoman Empire was broken up and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was broken up, from their remnants, new states emerged. Of course, the Kurds wanted a state of their own, but they weren't able to form a single delegation at Versailles. So there was no determination made about Kurdish statehood. As a result of that, their status was left ambiguous. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 promised that the Kurds would have a referendum within 1 year, and they'd be able to vote on whether they wanted independence. But soon after Sèvres, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk launched his War of Independence. Sèvres was overtaken by events. Western powers were weary from the First World War. They really didn't have any appetite for confronting Turkey. So they allowed Sèvres to essentially be nullified. And over the course of many months, there was a new conference, which culminated in the Treaty of Lausanne. And the Treaty of Lausanne didn't mention anywhere in the text the word Kurd or Kurdistan. So the first betrayal of the Kurds occurred between Sèvres and Lausanne, when the Western powers essentially went wobbly and left them alone. And then they became a divided nation. Kurds in Iraq, in Iran, in Turkey. They didn't achieve their national aspiration. And that's been the bane of Kurdish identity ever since. Differences among the Kurds, captive nations among countries in the Middle East. To this day, they still suffer from those same problems.
Before we get to the second treaty, can we talk about Sèvres and Lausanne? Because for us, from Sèvres to Lausanne has major implications for Greece and the Greek presence in Asia Minor. Do you think what the Kurds suffered in between their betrayal was because of the genius of Ataturk, or because of Western powers were not tough enough with Ataturk? I mean, Ataturk has this mythical quality in history, or mythical place in history, or did the West, did everybody else blow it?
So it was really a result of the cowardice of the West. The Kurds didn't help themselves, but countries that were allies during the First World War just had nothing left in their ammunition.
Especially the British?
Especially the British, but also the Italians, the French, and others. So all they wanted to do was to move on. Ataturk presented himself as European, modern, Western, secular. So he sold these countries a bill of goods. And people in the Republic of Turkey paid a very high price for Western cowardice towards Ataturk.
Second betrayal.
And Endy, can I hop in right there?
Yeah.
Even though I'm Greek and very proud to be Greek, I feel like we could be partially responsible for that as well. Because had we not gone beyond the territory that was given to us in Sèvres and invaded further into Turkey, and had we not eventually lost that war of independence that Turkey fought, maybe Sèvres never would have been overturned and Lausanne never would have happened. And therefore the Kurds would have had their referendum. So, this one is all, I know we're all proud Greeks in the room, but I did want to say that.
Well, if Lloyd George didn't encourage us to do that too, so the British.
Exactly, it's a whole other story, but I'm happy to blame the Europeans as well, but I also know that we were right there at the time.
So the United States also bears a lot of responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. was offered a mandate over the Kurdish territory. The U.S. really didn't want to become a colonial power. And then in the middle of the Paris Peace Conference, Woodrow Wilson fell ill.
Yeah.
So he was the champion of self-determination. This was a kind of a new concept in international relations. And in his 14-point speech, he established a marker about the right of national groups to assert their national identity. He said that people in provinces are not to be bartered about from sovereignty to sovereignty, as if they were chattels and pawns in a game, even the great game now forever discredited. Tragically, Wilson never achieved his objectives. He was a champion of the League of Nations. In order for the League of Nations to be accepted, it required Senate ratification. Enfeebled from his illness, he returned to the United States, traveled around the country trying to persuade people at the local level to support a vote on the League. It was never approved, so his vision, not only for self-determination, but for a new system of global governance through the League of Nations, was essentially undermined. So in many ways, Wilson, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, died a very defeated and beaten man, because his vision for a new world order was never realized.
So then we get into the Cold War.
So the Cold War was another tragic period for the Kurds. Mullah Mustafa Barzani declared the Mahabad Republic in 1946. This was a country called Kurdistan, just by the name Mahabad. It was supported by the Soviet Union, but it was short-lived. The Mahabad Republic existed for less than a year, and then the Kurds were sold out. Essentially, they had support from Russia, but they didn't have state building or adequate leadership, so in less than a year, the Mahabad Republic collapsed. The Kurds went back to their villages, and in Iraq they suffered terrible abuses as a result of the racism of the Ba'ath Party. So Mullah Mustafa launched a rebellion. The Kurds are famous for rebellions, less famous for state building, but they're good fighters, as President Trump has said. So they launched a rebellion. They negotiated with the government of Iraq an agreement on autonomy that was pretty exemplary in almost every respect. There was a Kurdish vice president, there were Kurdish quotas in the parliament, Kurdish language and culture was affirmed. But this was just a device by the Ba'ath Party to get the Kurds out of the way. Soon the Kurds realized that their deal with Baghdad was not genuine, so they rebelled again. And this became an ongoing battle between the government of Iraq and the Kurds. The Kurds live in a mountainous region, the Zagros Mountains, up on the Iran-Iraq border. They were victims of the Cold War because the US supported them up to a point. Through the Baghdad Pact, Iraq was allied with Russia. But the US was not really sincere in its efforts to lift up the Kurdish nation state. So in 1975, at the OPEC meeting, Henry Kissinger worked behind the scenes to...
Another common villain, man. You're getting all these. Another favorite.
You know, I went to a dinner for Henry Kissinger not long ago, and I walked out in the middle of the dinner.
Yeah.
Because whether it was East Timor, or whether it was the Kurds, he was responsible
Cyprus.
for blessing so many atrocities. And here again, the US blessed a deal between Iran and Iraq that was disadvantageous to the Kurds. The Algiers Accord. And the deal left the Kurds without a homeland, without a patron. And Mullah Mustafa Barzani fell ill. He was diagnosed with cancer. Kissinger arranged for him to go to the Mayo Clinic. First he went to Iran, and he was a, quote, guest of the Iranian government, but that was really being a prisoner. He was moved from there to the Mayo Clinic and ultimately to Maryland, where he died in 1979 from his cancer. His personal physician was my friend Dr. Karim that I spoke about earlier. So sitting with Dr. Karim on long trips to and from the region, I got an earful from him about his experience with Barzani and how the history of betrayal and abuse by the Kurds seemed to repeat itself. You know, only with adequate Kurdish leadership could they break that cycle, but they never were able to do that. And the United States, which purported to support the Kurds, also betrayed them time and again. And the next betrayal is by George H.W. Bush right after the Gulf War.
But running up to that betrayal, that's when the Kurds started getting more mass media, right? There was the gassing campaign, the Al-Anfal campaign by Saddam Hussein, right?
So the Al-Anfal campaign was called the Spoils. Mm-hmm. And this was essentially an attempt by the Iraqi Republican Guard to exterminate the Kurds. Saddam believed that the Kurds were loyal to Iran. And in the Iran-Iraq war, he launched reprisals against the Kurds on the Iran-Iraq border. Halabja, which I visited, is a small town in Iraq, but very close to the Iranian border. And as part of the broader Al-Anfal campaign, in March of 1988, there was a chemical weapons attack. And that day, 5,000 Kurds were killed by CW. Ironically, the chemical weapons were provided to Saddam Hussein by the United States. The US thought that he would use them against Iran. You remember the Iranian Revolution occurred in '79, so the US essentially picked its poison, and it aligned itself with Saddam Hussein. When the Kurds were gassed, there was a big debate in Washington at the time that I was a part of about suspending the agricultural commodities export program, and it did not pass. So the most the US could muster was to withdraw commodity credits for Iraq, and still there wasn't adequate support because of the myopia of US policymakers left over from the events in Iran at the embassy in '79. So Halabja was a tragedy of enormous proportions, but the attack in Halabja occurred on a single day. I think it was March 17th, so we just had the anniversary. But it was part of this broader campaign that was launched by Ali Hassan al-Masjid, who was Saddam Hussein's cousin, to essentially create a security belt all along the Iran-Iraq border. So what they did is they killed all the people who lived there and they vacated the villages. And there were 237,000 Kurds who were killed during the Anfal over a course of about 18 months. And the number of villages that were destroyed were in the hundreds of thousands or millions. So this area became a wasteland. I remember on my first trip to Iraq, I went to Halabja. And this was in 1992, so the experience of chemical weapons attack was still fresh for the Kurds there. And I interviewed survivors, and I just heard some horrible stories, and I met people who were still suffering illnesses from exposure to sarin and mustard gas that was dropped on Halabja that day. I remember I met a Kurd who said, "I'm a tailor." I said, "I'd like to make you a traditional Kurdish outfit." So I thought to myself, well, that's nice, but how many places do I go around the world where somebody promises to send me a present? But he took my measurements, and then about 6 months later at my office in Washington, a package arrived, and it was a package of a traditional Kurdish uniform. It was just before the Kurdish Newroz, which is their New Year's celebration. So I went to the Newroz event in Maryland that year with Dr. Karim, fully clad in my Peshmerga clothing.
You do that? Okay, we gotta get him a fustanella.
I don't know what a fustanella is, but it sounds great.
It's a long kilt.
Is that right?
You went there first 92, that was the back end of the next betrayal.
So the next betrayal came at the end of the Gulf War. The U.S. organized a huge international coalition. That was in a day when Republican presidents still believed in diplomacy. And we put together dozens of countries. Of course, the force that liberated Kuwait from Iraqi occupation was largely US-led, but there were European countries involved and also plenty of countries from the Middle East region. And it turned into a turkey shoot. We came into Kuwait, we liberated it in a matter of days. The very vaunted Republican National Guard fled across the desert, and as they were driving north to Baghdad, US warplanes were shooting them and destroying their armor and their troop formations. It was an extremely one-sided victory. Then there was a debate amongst the Bush cabinet whether or not the US should go into Baghdad and get rid of Saddam Hussein. And the UN Security Council resolution was very explicit that the international coalition was authorized to drive Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. It wasn't authorized to execute regime change. So people like Dick Cheney and Colin Powell and others, who later became strong proponents of going into Iraq, argued against marching on Baghdad. And as a result of that, the US allowed Saddam to stay in place. But Bush felt that the Iraqi people could rise up and remove him. So through Voice of America, he gave a speech in which he urged the Iraqi military and people to take matters into their own hands and force Saddam Hussein, the dictator, to step aside and comply with UN resolutions and rejoin the family of nations. So encouraged by the United States and thinking that the US had their back, the Shiites in the south launched the Shaban Intifada. The Kurds in the north launched what was called the National Uprising. And 14 of Iraq's 18 provinces fell to these different rebel groups. So it was a very heady time. The Kurds went into Kirkuk. They seized files of the Mukhabarat, the Iraqi intelligence agency, which kept detailed records of all the Kurds that they had killed over the years, kept detailed property records about their Arabization program, changing the demography of the region. And when I went to Kurdistan in 1992, I was actually given a satchel full of the Mukhabarat documents. Later, they were transported out in tons, but I was the first person in my backpack to bring out the official records of the Al-Anfal and the Iraqi genocide. So the peace treaty between the US/international coalition and Baghdad rejected the use of any fixed-wing aircraft. It did not prohibit Saddam's army from flying helicopter gunships. And that was a fatal mistake by the negotiators, because after the rebels took these 14 provinces, Iraq counterattacked. They were able to use their air power and spread chaos and fear in the south and in the north. In the south, the Arabs lived in something called the marsh area, so they drained the marshes, which was a huge environmental disaster, but it was also denied the Shiite rebels a place to hide. In the north, the Kurds were still fresh with the memory of what had happened in Halabja. So when the gunships started to attack, there were rumors spreading that Iraq was attacking with chemical weapons, and 1.5 million Kurds fled. There's an expression that the Kurds have no friend but the mountains, because whenever they are attacked, they know that they can flee, they can head for the hills, and they can find safety there. So that's exactly what they did. About 500,000 went into Iran, about 1 million went into Turkey. President Özal, who I believe himself was a Kurd, although never declared, gave them sanctuary. At the UN, the US and Britain led an initiative to establish Operation Provide Comfort. So there was a massive humanitarian intervention to rescue the Kurds who were perched on mountaintops along the border. And then the Security Council authorized Operation Northern Watch, which essentially established north of the 36th parallel a no-fly zone. It was also a no-drive zone, although that wasn't declared in the resolution. So with the gunships neutralized, the Kurds came back from the mountains, they went back to their villages, and they started this process of recovery, of rebuilding their homes, of self-government, because now the Iraqi administrators had all left. The fact that the US forces were present on the ground and they were getting air cover and air protection was significant. So the Kurds launched an experiment in self-government and democracy. And in my view, other than Israel, the Kurds are still the most democratic people in the region.
I'm going to leave the questions on the last betrayal because it's the one that I think everybody here has seen in the news, the fight with ISIS, what the Kurds did. So I'll leave it for here, but I want to do a kind of a more mega question before we open up the floor. You know, the U.S. foreign policy has always been obsessed with Middle East issues, or at least contemporary, right? And and we see it even now with some debates, even new congressmen, about the fate of the Palestinians, the Arab Spring, and all this. But it seems the most consequential thing when we talk about a new Middle East or the undoing of Sykes-Picot is the fate of the Kurds. 35 million people across Iraq, Turkey, Syria, and Iran. Are we always going to have problems in the Middle East if there is no resolution I don't know how else to call it, the Kurdish question? Will you have to be writing in your paper book, new chapters for another betrayal? Because it seems on the one hand, the West is always going to need the Kurds because they're the only ones willing to fight and be relied on. But at the key moment, at the tipping point, they'll throw them under the bus.
So I did write another book called The Kurdish Spring, because at a moment in time, it seemed as though the Kurds were going to be able to get there, that they were going to be able to realize their national dreams. And then in 2014, they were hit by a perfect storm. ISIS attacked in August. It came across from Syria. The world price of oil collapsed, so the primary source of revenue to the Kurdistan regional government disappeared. And the deal between Baghdad and Erbil, the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan, on sharing revenue from the country's national oil production fell apart. So suddenly, the Kurds had a 1,000-kilometer border with ISIS. Their coffers were empty. Their relations with Arabs went sour. So their dreams of realizing a Kurdish Spring and achieving their own country were essentially lost. So the Kurds not only responded to America's appeal to fight ISIS, they fought ISIS because it was in their national interest. When ISIS came across from Syria, it was like a blitzkrieg. They went down the Tigris River Valley. They came right up to Samarra, which is the site of the Golden Dome Temple, one of the most holy shrines in Shiite Islam. Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani called the faithful to defend the Golden Mosque, so they were able to stop the ISIS advance there. But it was hardly an Iraqi army that was able to confront them. In fact, the US had spent, I think, $17 billion on a train and equip program to give the Iraqi army training and equipment. And when ISIS came across the border and occupied Mosul, Iraq's second largest city, they just completely abandoned their positions without fighting and fled. In fact, they left 4,000 armored Humvee vehicles in the parking lot with the keys in the ignition. The US had given them state-of-the-art military technology, and they just left it for ISIS. ISIS at the time was a few thousand fighters. What's the first thing they did when they went into Mosul? They went to the jail, and they released all the dead-enders. What's the second thing they did? They went to the Bank of Iraq, and they got $425 million out of the bank. So suddenly, ISIS found itself with a lot of money, with a lot of sophisticated weapons, without any opposition from the Iraqi armed forces. And during this ISIS invasion, Masoud Barzani announced that Kurdistan would hold a referendum on independence. So ISIS and the Kurds share something fundamental. They both reject Sykes-Picot.
The border system.
But beyond the intellectual rejection of Sykes-Picot, ISIS is an Arab phenomena, and they're deeply racist towards Kurds. So they stopped their offensive in Samarra, and they pivoted and they went back to Erbil. They got within 30 kilometers of Erbil. They took the city of Mahmur, which is sort of a PKK stronghold. And it looked like they were marching.
You're giving away a lot of your book, you know.
Well, I'd rather have a conversation than sell books.
Well, and you know most of these people already bought it, right? But
So, long story short, you know, the Kurds were about to collapse.
yeah,
The U.S. decided that they couldn't let ISIS take Erbil. There was U.S. oil companies there. There was a U.S. consulate. I think this was after the Benghazi consulate incident. So we just made a decision that we needed to protect the Kurds. President Obama, who was famous for championing the term leading from behind, did little to protect the Kurds at first. The U.S. said repeatedly that Iraqis had to come together and form a government of national unity before the U.S. would intervene militarily. Well, a government of national unity between Shiite extremists, Sunni Salafists, and pro-Western sectarian Kurds was just out of the question. So the U.S. made a decision to start bombing ISIS positions. Keep in mind that at this point they had all of this sophisticated armor. They had used improvised explosives devices and vehicle-borne IEDs. So they were a formidable force. And they were stopped really at the gates of Erbil. So the Kurds were able to establish this security zone contiguous to ISIS, but the U.S. intervention essentially saved them. I remember I was in the studio at NBC when all this was going on, and the anchor asked me about a C-130 transport that had just landed at the airport in Erbil to deliver weapons. And she said, "Isn't it wonderful that the U.S. has come to the rescue of the Peshmerga?" And I said, "Look more closely, that's an Iranian plane."
oh,
And the Iranians were the first ones to bring weapons to the Kurds. The U.S. didn't want to give sophisticated offensive weapons to the Peshmerga, which is a term that means those who stand before death. That's essentially the Kurdish fighters, because they were afraid that the Kurds would use those weapons in a fight against Baghdad for independence. So we gave them just enough. We dribbled out just enough weapons so that they could defend their homeland, but not enough so they could launch a counterattack or turn on the Arabs in Iraq. So there was a kind of status quo after this perfect storm until 2017. You want me to race forward a bit?
Yeah.
So the Kurds felt that they had stymied the ISIS offensive. Of course, Kurds would never talk about independence, but every Kurd dreamed of independence. And they glorified Barzani because he was their champion. He was the champion of an independent Kurdistan. So they held a referendum on independence. I think it was the 23rd of September, 2017. I remember I went down to the UN to Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza. I spoke to a Kurdish audience there, and my focus was really on Turkey. What I asked the crowd is, can Erdogan stop you from becoming independent? And the answer was no, he couldn't. But the US could. So after we recruited the Kurds to fight ISIS, after they went into Mosul and cleared the eastern side of the Tigris River, the US stuck to its one Iraq policy, to its Baghdad first policy. Even the delivery of US weapons was always done, according to the Department of Defense, by, with, and through Baghdad. So the US and our special envoy for the multinational coalition to defeat ISIS, Brett McGurk, refused to support the Kurds. I told Barzani, personally, I said, don't wait until after the Battle of Mosul. Your maximum leverage is now before the US fights in Mosul. They need you. They need the Peshmerga. After Mosul is liberated, the US won't stand by you. But of course, people in the White House told him to be patient, that the US would reward them. So once again, the Kurds had this referendum, 93% voted for independence, and they never were able to achieve a declaration of independence. Barzani kept making the point, this is not a declaration of independence. This starts a negotiation between Erbil and Baghdad. And we'll come up with a friendly divorce. We'll find a modus vivendi. But without US support, with US sticking to the one Iraq policy, the Kurdish dream was dead on arrival. A few weeks after this, hold your question for a second.
What our reasoning is for the one Iraq policy. Why do we care so much about one Iraq?
So the policy making in Washington was always dominated by Arabists. In the State Department, these are people who grew up working in Arab capitals. Their view was always about stability. And the idea that Kurds would achieve independence was a destabilizing event for Iraq. They also feared that an independent Iraqi Kurdistan would inspire the Kurds in Turkey to seek the same, as well as their affiliates in northern Syria. There are 10 million Kurds who live in Iran. I don't think we were somehow paying deference to Iran, but the Arabists and the proponents of stability won that debate. And
I think it would come from the other Kurds from the different countries who migrate to the new Kurdistan if there were one, whether it's in Iraq or Iraq and Syria, or.
So I don't think that was a reasonable prospect. You know, the Kurds looked across the border to Iraqi Kurdistan. They saw what their Kurdish brethren were achieving prior to the referendum with their self-rule and their economic development, and they just wanted the same. Meanwhile, in the countries where they lived, Kurds were getting trashed. We'll talk a little bit about the Kurds in Turkey and what they've experienced, but Kurds looked at the movement in Iraqi Kurdistan. They wanted the same thing, but they were scared. And they were scared because the US didn't support them. And I have to say, it's a great shame for me that I wasn't able to convince US policymakers that supporting an independent Kurdistan was in our national interest. Because I believe that Kurdistan, secular, democratic, pro-American, is something that we should have supported.
I just want to ask, in your vision of what an independent Kurdistan would that be parts of those countries in that region that
So I was an advocate for an independent Iraqi Kurdistan. Kurds have different languages, Kurmanji and Sorani. They have different tribes. It would have been impossible to gather all the Kurds in those 4 countries and create a greater Kurdistan.
By the way, this is really important because you see in Greek blogs all the time that there's going to be one Kurdistan. Even Turkish Kurds have important differences that would prevent.
But let me qualify that a little bit,
Yeah, sure.
because I support a greater Kurdistan. I just didn't think it was realistic to achieve at that time. I felt that the better strategy was to go step by step to realize an independent Iraqi Kurdistan.
Like states that would then form a greater union.
So I didn't foresee what would happen after that. I didn't foresee how Iran and Turkey would come together and close the borders and shut the airports down. So I was thinking in the short term. Kirkuk was always a flashpoint, which Governor Karim explained to me many times. It had been largely a Turkoman town. When the Baba Gur, the great oil gusher, was discovered there in 1923, Arabs and Kurds were imported as oil laborers. So the ethnography of Kirkuk changed. When ISIS invaded, the Kurds were quick to have their Peshmerga seize Kirkuk, so it became an entirely Kurdish city. And Kirkuk is both a city and it's also a province. So you often heard Jalal Talabani, who's the head of the PUK, say that Kirkuk is like our Jerusalem. We cannot achieve independence without it. And also the project of state building needed money. And all the money was in the Kirkuk oil fields. There are 45 million barrels of oil there, which, by the way, gets transported through the Kirkuk-Ceyhan pipeline across the border to Turkey and then onto tankers at the port of Ceyhan. So the Kurds had this kind of ambivalent and confused relationship with Turkey. They felt loyalty to their Kurdish brethren in Turkey who were getting tortured and arrested and killed, but they needed Turkey as a conduit for their oil and as a steady stream of income for their wealth. The event that occurred next, which to me is a great shame, is the US decision to abandon Kirkuk to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. There's a Shiite militia in Iraq called the Hashid al-Shabi. They came to Governor Karim's home to assassinate him. There was actually a Marine whose name was Endy. I've seen the text messages from Endy to Karim's son, Sirwan, saying, the Hashid al-Shabi are coming, you need to get out of there. But it wasn't just the Hashid al-Shabi. There was a deal made at the 11th hour between Talabani's PUK, the Shiite militias, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard to drive Karim out of Kirkuk, to seize the province of Kirkuk, to capture all of its oil wealth. And for several days, Karim couldn't be found. We did find him. Actually, the senator from Maryland was a great help, but what happened in Kirkuk was an enormous tragedy. The fall of Kirkuk to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard was organized by Qasem Soleimani, who is the head of the Quds Force, a very brutal Shiite Iranian criminal who's responsible for all kinds of crimes in the region against Sunnis and against Americans. So I couldn't understand why the US allowed that to happen. Except today, my understanding is that we didn't want Kirkuk to be independent. We knew that if Iran controlled Kirkuk, the Kurds wouldn't be able to achieve their state-building goals. So we essentially colluded with Tehran to allow Iranian forces into Kirkuk to occupy it to prevent Iraqi Kurdistan from becoming independent. So if that isn't a moral crime and a complete denial of U.S. national interests, I don't know what is. So that was the most recent betrayal of the Kurds, the failure to support the referendum, followed 3 weeks later by the IRGC attack and occupation of Kirkuk, where we essentially just turned a blind eye on Governor Karim, our friend, let him go underground. If it wasn't for a few Marines and his own security forces acting on his own, they would have strung him up and he would have been flying from a lamppost.
Actually, Professor, I have a question for you that may go beyond some of what you discussed. The first is, what does Kobani mean in the greater picture?
What's Kobani mean?
What's Kobani mean, right? The greater picture of the battle of Kobani for the Kurds in terms of identity and future. And the other is, up until this point, right, say since Sykes-Picot, the Kurds have been living in these various countries. But going forward, is the Kurdish identity such now where it's going to be permanent agitation? Or do you think they could be suppressed long term?
So I forget the term in Kurdish, which means struggle. They're not going away. And even if Turkish forces come into their villages and destroy their cities, they will just continue their insurrection. So it's not a war you can win militarily. The only way you can solve the Kurdish problem in Turkey is through decentralization and negotiation, which is something that Erdogan is completely opposed to, because in his view, federalism or devolution is a pit stop on the path to fragmentation. And the idea of Turkey as a unitary state, the motto that was, the banner that was hanging in Diyarbakir on my first trip, all Kurds are happy to be Turks. They were even called Mountain Turks, not Kurds. So, they had a complete denial of their identity. So, your question, I think, is a very nice segue from Iraq to Syria, which I'd like to discuss a little bit more. I was fearful that the Kurds in Syria would suffer the same fate as the Kurds in Iraq. And with Trump's recent announcement, it's entirely possible that we'll see a slaughter of Syrian Kurds on the proportion of what happened to the Armenians or the Pontian Greeks in 1915 and 1919 by Turkey. So Turkey was working with the CIA, Turkey's National Intelligence Agency, to try to train and equip an Arab Sunni force against Bashar al-Assad. In 2013, August 21, 2013, Assad used chemical weapons and he attacked a suburb of Damascus named Ghouta. On that day, 1,389 people died from chemical weapons. More than 400 children died. President Obama had drawn a red line in the sand. He basically said, we will not tolerate the use of chemical weapons. U.S. satellites and U.S. intelligence saw that Syria was moving its capabilities to launch a CW attack, which is why Obama made that statement. But in Obama's mind, he made the statement not because he was going to back it up, but as a way of deterring Assad from launching the attack. Obviously, that didn't work. So the U.S. started to prevaricate after that. And you remember at about that time, Damascus was isolated. The Damascus suburbs, including Ghouta, were entirely occupied by Arab Sunnis. And in Syria, unlike Iraq, the Alawites, who are close to Shiism, only represent 18 to 20% of the population. About 60% are Sunni Arab. So this was a popular uprising. It started in Dara with some school children who wrote in Arabic messages about human rights on their school wall. And what Assad did is he took a page from his father's playbook, which is referred to, which Tom Friedman and others have coined the term Hama rules. Basically, Syria responds to dissent with absolute and brute force. So this is what they tried to do during the early days of the Arab Spring in Syria. When it looked as though they might get overrun, they resorted to chemical weapons. In response to this, Turkey was furious. Turkey had pledged that they would remove Assad from power, and they launched an operation to provide weapons, financing, logistics to Sunni Arab fighters. In fact, it was even called the Jihadi Highway from Sanliurfa to Raqqa, starting after the attack in Ghouta. Erdogan basically took it into his own hands. He said, if the US isn't going to back up its red line, I will. And Turkey systematically supported jihadi groups extensively with all kinds of sophisticated weapons. Even wounded warriors in Syria ended up in hospitals in Turkey without any paperwork. I have a friend who's a Turkish doctor, and she said they would come in all the time. They were told to provide healthcare services to these jihadists without any payment. And these jihadi groups morphed into ISIS. So you asked about Kobani. Kobani is a largely Kurdish city right on the Turkish border. I think it was September of 2015, ISIS attacked Kobani, and they occupied the villages around Kobani easily. They committed all kinds of atrocities, beheading their victims. They tried to enter the city of Kobani, and there they met stiff resistance from the People's Protection Forces, which are the Kurds in Syria, and also something called the YPJ, which is the Kurdish Women's Defense Forces. And I've met with the commander-in-chief of the Syrian Kurdish women. She's one tough cookie. 40% of Kobani's defenders were women. Initially, the US felt that we didn't have a dog in that fight, and we wouldn't help the Syrian Kurds. Well-educated scholars and diplomats like Ryan Crocker said there's no strategic value to Kobani, we shouldn't be involved. But then there was a decision taken in the White House that if Kobani fell, and there were still tens of thousands of Kurds living there, that it would be used by ISIS as a kind of poster child for its international recruitment. Think about the composition of ISIS in 2015. It started as a few thousand fighters who came from Syria into Iraq. They liberated the jails and got Arab Sunnis and Salafists to join them. And then, with the beheading of James Foley and others, they appealed to Sunnis to come to Syria and Iraq from around the world, and their forces swelled from 10,000 with 40,000 foreign fighters. So the decision by the Obama administration to intervene in Kobani was essentially to deter the videotaping and through ISIS television, the dissemination of incredible images of slaughter. So the US started to bomb ISIS positions. Kurds in Turkey tried to come to the rescue of Kurds in Syria. Turkish security blocked them from going in. Culturally, politically, spiritually, the Kurds in Turkey and the Kurds in Syria are in common. Erdogan says that the YPG and the YPJ are just branches of the PKK. The US government has a different view. The PKK is listed as a foreign terrorist organization, an FTO, but we don't consider the Syrian Kurds terrorists. That's largely a semantical distinction because we wanted to provide them with military support, and US law prohibits the delivery of US weapons to groups that are on the FTO list. I have to tell you, when I went to northern Syria, one of the things that shocked me is that everywhere you look, there are posters and photos of Abdullah Öcalan. So they say that they're operationally independent.
He was the head of the PKK.
Who's the head of the PKK, who is in Imrali prison in the middle of the Aegean Sea, where he still runs the organization.
Yeah.
So he's very much an inspiration for Syrian Kurds. And by the way, I'm on record saying that the PKK was put on the FTO list as part of a deal with Turkey after Afghanistan to have Turkey lead the ISAF force for Afghanistan. And there's no peace in Turkey, there's no place for Kurds unless we're prepared to remove them from the FTO list as part of a negotiation on transforming the PKK from an armed force into truly a political party. So I'm on record saying that the PKK should be delisted. But to get back to your point, the US had a discovery. These Kurds could fight. They defeated ISIS in Kobani. They pivoted along the Turkish border to Halabja, which was along one of the transit routes that Turkey was using to move weapons from Turkey to ISIS in Syria. They liberated Halabja, essentially blocking that transit. And then the US started to expand its security cooperation, training them, giving them more armor, more offensive and sophisticated weapons. When we drew up our battle plans to liberate Raqqa, we needed to have boots on the ground, and the YPG and the YPJ served that purpose. So they went into Raqqa, they fought house to house, and the whole city was booby-trapped. There were IEDs everywhere, there were tunnels, so they'd go into a neighborhood and then ISIS fighters would pop up behind them from out of a tunnel. You know, the Kurds, the YPG, to date, have lost 11,000 fighters. And they did that in service of America's interests. So I told the Salih Muslim and their political leaders, I said, you need to get a commitment from the US that you'll get supported. Why are you prepared to sacrifice all of this man and woman power without a commitment from the US that they'll uphold your political goals? But they also had a self-interest in defeating ISIS. The US signaled some kinds of support to them, but it was superficial and disingenuous.
Give me a 30 seconds break.
Absolutely.
I got some famous journalists from Athens, so that I can see the future of homogeneity.
Hi, everybody. Welcome.
Sorry for the interruption.
Not at all. Join us.
So you're welcome to join if you
Get
like.
some questions on the Kurds. 1, 2. Let's start here. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for your analysis. Just a follow-up question to your recent comment. Would you be concerned about a third Turkish military operation in Syria, especially if the result of the Sunday local election is not the one Erdogan wishes for?
So I think you've been reading my lecture notes, because that's exactly the topic that I want to talk about next. You know, the Kurds established a self-governing territory in contiguous lands in Hasaka, Kobani, and a third province, the name of which eludes me. And to Erdogan, this was like an existential threat, because this is exactly what happened in Iraqi Kurdistan. And the US was cooperating with the Kurds to fight ISIS and to support their political agenda, although that was never stated. US officials would go to Ankara, we'd tell the Turkish officials what they wanted to hear, then we'd go to northern Syria, we'd tell the Kurds what they wanted to hear, but materially on the ground, we were fighting with the YPG. And we deployed several thousand special forces and enormous air power to help their operation. So after Raqqa, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson announced that the US would create something called a border security force, with 40,000 Kurds under arms. Erdogan went ballistic. He said, you know, who do you support, the terrorists or your NATO ally? The NATO ally being a state sponsor of terrorism, in my view. So he said, we are going to attack the city of Afrin, and then we are going to pivot east. We're going to liberate Manbij on the Euphrates River, and we're going to go all the way to the Iraqi border. And true to his word, that's exactly what he did. Afrin is an idyllic mountain hamlet. It was not militarized. It was resident to civilians. And Turkey started bombing. And they bombed, they started on January 20th, 2018. They bombed for 58 days. You know, the YPG and the YPJ were heroic. They rushed to Afrin to help defend the city. But with that kind of overwhelming air power, there was very little that they could do. The foot soldiers for Turkey was the Free Syrian Army. And let's make no mistake about it, the FSA is a jihadi ISIS affiliate with its origins in Al-Qaeda. So they advanced on Afrin. There were videos that surfaced of the FSA encouraging a 12-year-old boy to behead a Kurdish fighter. A YPJ member, a woman, was stripped naked when she was killed, and the FSA cut off her breasts and threw her breasts around as though they were toys. These people are barbaric. These are terrorists. These are Turkish allies. And they fight and they work with Erdogan because they share the same ideology and the same worldview. By the time the town of Afrin, the city of Afrin, fell, there were 358 civilians who died. There were more than 1,000 fighters who were killed. Between 250 and 300,000 Kurds fled and became internally displaced within Syria. Many of them went east of the Euphrates River, where other Kurds gave them sanctuary. So the story of what happened in Rojava, Turkey's aggression, and then Erdogan's commitment to continue the fight, to take Manbij, and then Kamishlo, and go right up to the Fish-Kabur border with Iraq, was a real threat. When Erdogan says he's going to come and kill Kurds because they're terrorists, what we've learned is to take him at his word. So that's exactly what he did. If the US hadn't been there to safeguard the Kurds in Manbij and to send signals through their military presence on the ground that those kind of atrocities wouldn't be tolerated, Erdogan would have rolled through what is a relatively flat land. There are no mountains for the Kurds to flee there. But the US presence acted as a deterrent. So let me just tell you the next phase of this. I went to speak at the University of Rojava about constitutional arrangements for power sharing, because I felt that if the Kurds could make a deal with Damascus, that would establish a positive momentum of power sharing that could have effect elsewhere in Syria. So I was so impressed with the spirit of Rojava. It reminded me of the kibbutz in Israel in the 1950s. So people sacrificing in service of some communal interest. And the PYD really walk the talk. They have rules that every agency has to be co-chaired by a man and a woman. So gender equality is a big part of their ideology. They believe in environmental sustainability. No plastic bags are allowed in Rojava. They also believe in local grassroots democracy. And they have village councils that are self-governing. It's really, truly inspirational. So I crossed the river to go to my conference in Kamishlo. I crossed with my old friend Bernard Kouchner, a former foreign minister of France, who's written a nice endorsement of the book. And I felt so positively about the Syrian Kurds as our allies. I left on December 17th. 48 hours later, President Trump got on the phone with Tayyip Erdogan. The purpose of the call was to tell Erdogan that he shouldn't attack the Kurds in Syria. And in the middle of the conversation, Trump told Erdogan, if you think you can clear the area of ISIS, it's yours. Take it. So imagine the shock of US officials. James Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, resigned to object. Brett McGurk, who I criticized earlier, also resigned. After Mattis resigned, I sent Brett a message saying, man up, Brett, you should resign too. I don't know if he did it because I told him to, but a couple of days later, sure enough, he did.
Somebody just said I triple dog dare you to resign.
Well, I don't think Brett is a person of great
So do you think,
integrity.
do you think another attack's coming after the Turkish election?
So as long as the U.S. maintains a presence in
Syria?
That will be an effective deterrent, because Turkey doesn't want to have collateral damage and kill U.S. special forces.
So if a withdrawal comes, we can count on it.
So if the U.S. withdraws, Turkey will invade in a day. They will sweep through that territory and they will kill tens of thousands, displace hundreds of thousands, and commit enormous war crimes, all in the name of fighting terrorism. And let me tell you, these Syrian Kurds are not terrorists. They are pro-American, they are pro-Western, they are Democrats at their core. They may love the Öcalan ideal, but frankly, given their situation, who can blame them?
Okay, I'm going to do a lightning round because even though we don't
we losing
mind
time?
starting, even though we don't mind starting on Greek time, we don't end on Greek time. So I'm going to collect all the questions, and really make you go fast.
Okay.
I like it. All right.
Can I use your pen a second?
Yeah, I'm writing them down for you.
Oh, yeah?
A
Okay.
few words about what happens next now that the U.S. administration declared victory over ISIS.
Okay.
I mean, what's happening with the foreign fighters? Where
Foreign fighters. You had a question, sir?
Mine's somewhat specific, but I've always been curious about how ISIS was able to continue their financial support moving oil, and where did they move that oil, and how did they move that oil? What did that oil not allow that go and be sold to Turkey and go through Turkey?
Erdogan's son-in-law.
Let's take a third question and then
Yeah,
let's pause.
I'd like to better understand sort of the Kurdish diaspora. Is it, outside of the Middle East and Turkey, are there communities, advocacy, or academia in, Germany or North America generally? Do you feel like you're a lone wolf in your field, or is there?
So let me answer that question first. There's not a very large Kurdish diaspora here. When there was a civil war between the PUK and the KDP, and Saddam was able to come back in to Erbil, the U.S. had lots of Iraqi Kurds that it was working with, and we airlifted thousands to Guam, and then they were resettled around the country, and they ended up in some funny places like Indianapolis and Kentucky. Somehow these became Kurdish enclaves. But there is no organized Kurdish
For all
diaspora.
our members in Indianapolis, Kentucky, we love you. We'll do a book event for you too. No.
So, and they've been very hospitable to the Kurds there.
Yeah.
So financial support. So after raiding the bank, ISIS supported itself by selling antiquities, by selling slaves, and by selling oil. And you're spot on with your question. They moved their oil, they sold their oil to middlemen who sold it in Turkey. Who was the energy minister of Turkey at the time? Berat al-Bayrak,
So they
The
just
son-in-law.
the son-in-law of Erdogan, who profited enormously buying ISIS oil at a discount. I've done a research paper on not only the ISIS-Turkey links, but also the ISIS-Turkey oil links I can share with you. So then they moved the oil to the Mediterranean. And Erdogan's son owned oil tankers. And Berat sold him the oil at a discount. And then they mixed the oil with other sources of supply and sold it on the international marketplace. So the family enterprise, criminal enterprise of President Erdogan, his son, Bilal, his son-in-law, Berat, were all profiting off of everyone's misfortune. And Joe Biden said it at a trip to Harvard in 2015. He said, I talked to Erdogan about ISIS. He told me, we let too many of them come through Turkey. Of course, Erdogan reacted strongly, saying, I never said any such thing. But Turkey and ISIS worked hand in hand, not only on the battlefield, but in economic terms.
And the ISIS fighters? Is ISIS defeated?
So is ISIS defeated? So the caliphate, which Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi declared, which is a territory, is defeated. At its peak in 2017, ISIS controlled territory the size of Great Britain. The idea that ISIS has been defeated, Trump was quick to say, they're totally destroyed, they're on the run, we have had a great victory. ISIS isn't just a group of fighters. ISIS is an ideology. And it's true, ISIS doesn't control any territory now. So the caliphate is dead. But ISIS is alive and well. ISIS has franchises in 38 countries. They committed scores of attacks last year. More than 1,400 people died as a result of ISIS attacks. And where did all these ISIS fighters go? They just didn't disappear. When the Kurds came into Baghouz and they fought bitterly for the last square mile of land, all the defenders were foreign fighters because they had no place to go. The ISIS Arabs just blended back into the population. And the important thing to recognize is that the reason why ISIS won so easily is because the Arab Sunnis in Iraq and Syria rolled out the red rug for them. They maybe discovered that the caliphate was harsher and Sharia more intense than they thought it would be, but the initial response was overwhelmingly hospitable. So we haven't defeated ISIS. If we don't continue to go after them, they will regroup. They'll take territory back in Syria and Iraq. And the foreign fighters who were able to escape, well, frankly, they went back to France and to London and to their home countries where they're organizing terror attacks as we speak.
Okay. We got 3 minutes to see if you can ask a question that gets a one-word answer or a one-sentence answer. Go on.
Could we go back to the idea of decentralization as a possible solution? And does that apply to the Kurds in Turkey and in Syria? And if not, how might that be different? And if you could just go into a little bit more detail about possible power shares that you're talking about.
You laid out what Turkey is in their interests. What happens if they do get the F-35s and how that amplifies their behavior in the region?
So some maps NATO that show that part of Turkey and northern Syria, there's something called Kurdistan. Some NATO maps that actually were presented in official conferences. So how possible is this scenario?
So let's talk about power sharing, because it's one of my most favorite topics. I've long said that at the end of this grinding civil war in Syria, Syria will look a lot like Bosnia did after the Dayton Peace Agreement. You'll have a central government with limited powers. You'll have highly decentralized powers where local groups are responsible for security, for governance, for humanitarian and economic development. The only way that Syria stays together after this war is through this kind of devolution. Russia's involvement, giving Assad a victory, and Russia's collusion to allow Turkey's planes to attack Afrin which was a Russian zone of control, maybe raise questions about the prospects for devolution. But in my view, it's still the way to go, and that's what I was there lecturing the Syrian Kurds about. The Kurds in Iraq said they would stay in Iraq as long as Iraq was democratic, federal, and a republic. It never was. And the Shiite-led government in Baghdad, which is backed by Iran, provides no power sharing to different groups in Iraq. So the F-35s, if Turkey takes possession of the S-400s, then by virtue of the legislation that was dropped today, and by virtue of any common sense foreign policy, the US isn't going to allow Turkey to stay in the consortium. How could we possibly transfer F-35s with sophisticated stealth technology to Turkey, who's working alongside Russian military attachés to stand up the S-400s? So in my view, that's not going to happen. I'm working on a piece now calling for a radical rethink of US-Turkey relations. And it's not just over the S-400s or the F-35s. The US and Turkey have been hand in glove for decades. And whether it's security cooperation or economic cooperation, it's time for the US to recognize that Turkey is not a NATO ally. If it applied to join NATO today because it's anti-American, Islamist, it would simply not be accepted. So we need to have a reevaluation of US relations with Turkey. And we should see Turkey as it is. Turkey is not an ally, it's a strategic adversary. And if it gets S-400 missiles and F-35s, it's not an adversary, it's a dangerous enemy.
And the maps?
I don't know about the maps.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that one.
Keep your friends close.
Yes.
Enemies closer.
So, I did ask Barham Saleh, who's my good friend, who's now the president of Iraq, to give me some of the maps that they confiscated from Iraq when they liberated Kurdistan. And he gave me an Iraqi military intelligence map. And I was teaching a class. I had a competition with students. I said, whoever does the best presentation, I'm going to give you the map. So I waited for years to get this map. I loved it, but then I gave it away. I guess like most things, if you love it and you give it away, it may come back to you.
Well, a lot of you have already gotten the book, so I'll bring them up for those of you who got it. I think we still have. So David is always gracious about signing and writing good messages in his book.
In Greek.
He can try.
I know how to say one thing in Greek. Si agapo.
That's good enough. You'll get this guy gets a sagapo through me. Listen, I think it's a must read. It's not extremely long. It's also very helpful because you put that glossary of players and organizations. But I promise you, whatever you're going to be reading in the news about the Middle East, this is a central question, and we haven't come to terms with it yet in the United States. We deal a lot with Turkey. Some of us, the Cypriot foreign minister spoke at APAC this week and said that the Eastern Mediterranean countries are doing a security and cooperation organization to deal with the greater Middle East. And if this issue is not taken care of it, there's going to be no security nor cooperation in the greater Middle East. Thanks for always being available, and thanks for doing great work again.
Thank you all for coming. So do you want me to sit and sign?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or unless you want to